While the world focused on the battlefields and concentration camps, the Nazis were carrying out something equally disturbing in secret. They weren't just trying to erase lives, they were trying to breed them. The Lebensborn program was designed to create a master race from the cradle up, and what happened inside those walls still haunts the lives of thousands today. It began in 1935, quietly, with the program that the world wouldn't learn about until it was too late. Lebensborn, translated as Fountain of Life, was the brainchild of Heinrich Himmler, the head of the SS, and one of Adolf Hitler's most loyal followers. Himmler had no background in medicine or genetics, but he had a fanatical belief in racial purity. His idea wasn't just to preserve the so-called Aryan race. It was to manufacture it, to breed it into existence through state control. The foundation of Lebensborn was based on warped science and racial pseudo-theories popular among Nazi elites. German women who fit the racial ideal weren't just seen as citizens, they were treated like national assets. Himmler envisioned a society where the state would take the reins of reproduction, intervening directly to shape future generations. He believed Germany's strength depended on increasing the birth rate of racially valuable children, especially as the country prepared for war. The Lebensborn program was created under the SS Welfare Organization, known as the SS Race and Settlement Main Office. It was first disguised as a charitable effort to help struggling mothers, but the real agenda was eugenics. Everything from the architecture of the homes to the training of the midwives was carefully controlled to fit this racial vision. The first Lebensborn home was set up in December 1935 in Steinhöring, Bavaria, a quiet town near Munich. The home was located in a former nursing institution and was outfitted to provide prenatal care, delivery services, and child-rearing assistance. But it also served as a gatekeeping facility with strict rules about who could enter. By the end of the decade, more homes had opened in occupied territories. The program took root quickly, in part because it served multiple purposes. It aimed to reverse a declining birth rate among Germans, offering a solution to rising illegitimacy rates, and gave the regime an opportunity to mold future generations from birth. But its most sinister aspect was its obsession with bloodlines. Lebensborn also connected to the broader goals of the Third Reich's demographic warfare. As Nazi Germany expanded, the program evolved into something even darker. The selection process for Lebensborn wasn't rooted in compassion or respect. It was rooted in Nazi racial pseudoscience. Women were treated as tools, judged not by character or intellect, but by how well their bodies matched the regime's racial blueprint. In the eyes of the Nazis, the ideal woman was not an individual, she was a vessel for breeding. Before a woman could even be considered, she had to pass an extensive screening conducted by SS doctors and racial experts. These weren't casual checkups. They were invasive and deeply humiliating. Physical exams included measuring the shape of the nose, the width of the jaw, and proportions of the body. Even the distance between the eyes could be a deciding factor. These women were often asked to undress in front of male examiners who evaluated their fitness like a specimen. The scrutiny didn't stop at physical appearance. Investigators also combed through generations of family records, looking for any hint of non-Aryan ancestry, Jewish blood, or hereditary illnesses. If any defect, mental, physical, or genealogical, was found, the woman was rejected outright. Even rumors of moral weakness, like having a mentally ill cousin or a criminal uncle, could lead to disqualification. The age of the women selected was shockingly low. Some were still in school, barely out of childhood themselves. The Nazi regime saw this as a long-term investment. The younger they were, the more children they could produce over time. Some of these girls entered the program believing it was patriotic or honorable. In many cases, the local Nazi Party officials or teachers had encouraged them to apply. Others were misled or coerced into participating, told it was their duty to serve the Reich. While the official stance was the women participated willingly, the reality was much darker. Some were pressured into sexual relationships with SS officers under the guise of racial matchmaking. In these cases, Refusal wasn't always an option. The regime didn't care about emotional bonds or consent. It wanted results. Over 20,000 children were born directly inside Lebensborn homes between 1935 and 1945, but that number doesn't fully reflect the program's reach. These children weren't just the result of planned pairings between SS men and racially approved women. They became the living symbols of the Nazis' twisted dream of racial perfection, and from birth, their lives were tightly controlled by the regime. For the children born in the Lebensborn clinics, their identities were shaped from the moment they took their first breath. Many were taken from their biological mothers shortly after birth, especially if the mother was unmarried or considered socially unfit to raise a valuable child. The SS would hand these infants over to families loyal to the Nazi regime, ideally ones with SS fathers who were expected to raise them under strict ideological and racial standards. These adoptive families were not chosen out of compassion, but rather based on how well they could mold the child into a loyal servant of the Reich. Those not adopted right away were sent to specially selected Nazi-run institutions and boarding schools, where they were subjected to a constant stream of racial ideology. Everything they learned was designed to reinforce the idea that they were genetically superior. Playtime, meals, and bedtime routines were all structured around discipline, physical strength, and blind loyalty. But Lebensborn wasn't only about German-born babies. As the Nazis spread their control across Europe, they turned the program into something even darker. In places like Czechoslovakia, Yugoslavia, and Poland, thousands of children were forcibly removed from their families because they had the right features. Nazi officers would visit orphanages, hospitals, and even rural homes, searching for children with blonde hair, fair skin, and blue eyes. Poland suffered the most. As soon as German troops invaded Poland in 1939, the Nazi regime began more than just military occupation. They launched a systematic campaign to steal children. Children were often taken by force, torn from their families in the middle of the night, or separated during deportations. Sometimes whole groups of children were rounded up from orphanages or schools. Parents were told their children had died of illness, only to later discover they had been abducted. This psychological reprogramming was deliberate and methodical. Children were told over and over that their old families were enemies, and that they were lucky to be rescued by Germany. One of the central facilities in this process was the camp at Lodz, Poland, which the Nazis renamed Litzmannstadt. Within this city, a special center called Kinder KZ was created. It looked like an ordinary orphanage from the outside, but inside, doctors performed racial assessments, physical exams, and psychological tests. Children who were deemed unfit often faced grim fates. Some were sent to other camps for forced labor. Others simply disappeared. Those who passed the tests were given new German names, taught the German language, and placed into Lebensborn homes or fostered by Nazi-approved families. Many were told their biological parents were dead or had abandoned them. They were then raised to believe they were German from birth. The scale of this operation was massive. Historians estimate that at least 200,000 children were kidnapped from Eastern Europe during the war, with Poland suffering the greatest number of abductions. Other countries targeted included Slovenia, Ukraine, the Czech lands, and parts of the Soviet Union. The process was bureaucratic and organized. Files were kept, transport routes were mapped out, and each child was tagged like inventory. After the war, efforts to locate and return these children were difficult and often unsuccessful. Many had been relocated deep into Germany or Austria. Their records were altered or destroyed. Some children had lived for years believing they were German and rejected the idea of returning to a country or family they couldn't remember. The International Red Cross and post-war Polish authorities tried to recover as many as possible, but the emotional and logistical barriers were enormous. In the end, only a small fraction, around 15%, were ever reunited with their birth families. The exterior of Lebensborn homes was designed to look welcoming. Large country houses or villas, often in quiet, picturesque areas. From a distance, they looked like safe places for expecting mothers. But behind the doors, these homes operated with military precision and chilling indifference. Pregnant women admitted to these homes were immediately subjected to strict rules and surveillance. Their daily routines were rigid: scheduled meals, regulated rest times, and mandatory medical checks. Nutrition was controlled carefully, not for the mother's well-being, but to ensure the child's development matched the Nazis' ideal of Aryan perfection. The women had little autonomy and were constantly monitored by nurses and midwives loyal to the SS. Emotional attachment was discouraged. Staff were trained to view the pregnancies as clinical processes rather than maternal experiences. Nurses did not comfort the mothers. Instead, they observed them just like test subjects in an experiment. Conversations were limited, and outside contact was restricted. Mothers were often not told what would happen to their babies, only that they would be taken care of by the state. After birth, infants were immediately examined. Their physical features were assessed. Babies deemed racially viable were documented, tagged, and separated. If a child failed to meet racial expectations due to a deformity, a health issue, or even slightly darker features, the consequences could be fatal. For the staff inside Lebensborn homes, the babies were not children in the traditional sense. They were genetic material, subject to approval or disposal. The process was industrial, methodical, and deeply inhuman. In many ways, the Lebensborn homes functioned like factories. They were designed to take in young women, extract their reproductive value, and discard the rest. Norway wasn't just a side note in the Lebensborn program, it was a central piece of the Nazis' racial blueprint. The Nazi regime saw Scandinavians as some of the closest to the so-called Aryan ideal outside of Germany. Heinrich Himmler believed Norway was the perfect ground for racial expansion. He even wanted to turn the country into a breeding colony for the SS. German soldiers stationed in Norway were openly encouraged to pursue Norwegian women, especially those with light features. The relationships weren't always forced, but they were heavily promoted by Nazi propaganda. In some cases, soldiers promised the women protection or status. In others, the women were manipulated or pressured. At least 9 Lebensborn homes were established across Norway. These facilities offered free medical care and secrecy for the mothers. Some women believed they were helping build a better future for their country, especially during the German occupation. Others didn't know the true purpose of the program until they had already given birth. By the end of the war, roughly 12,000 children had been born under this system in Norway alone. But once the Nazis were defeated, the children and their mother became targets, not just of public scorn, but of institutional abuse. The Norwegian government, eager to restore its image after years of German occupation, treated the Lebensborn children as a national disgrace. Some were forcibly removed from their mothers and placed in remote orphanages or psychiatric facilities. Inside these institutions, many were subjected to isolation, humiliation, and violence. Worse still, some of the children became the subjects of psychological experiments. In the 1950s and 60s, under classified programs partially supported by foreign governments, a number of Lebensborn children were used in studies without consent. These experiments were framed as scientific research into inherited behavior or mental illness. In truth, they were acts of state-sanctioned cruelty. After Nazi Germany collapsed in 1945, Allied forces uncovered the infrastructure and documents behind the Lebensborn program. But even with evidence in hand, unraveling the scale and purpose of the program proved difficult. Lebensborn wasn't like the death camps. It didn't leave behind mass graves or gas chambers. Its crimes were buried in paperwork, secrecy, and silence. Heinrich Himmler committed suicide shortly after his capture. Without him, many questions about Lebensborn's full intent were left unanswered. As Allied investigators tried to piece things together, they found that most staff members, midwives, administrators, and even senior SS figures connected to the homes had vanished. Many used false names and papers to disappear into post-war society. However, the Allied powers sought to bring Nazi perpetrators to justice through a series of military tribunals. Among these was the Russia trial, officially known as United States of America v. Ulrich Grefeld et al., which commenced on October 20, 1947. This trial focused on 14 high-ranking officials from the SS Race and Settlement Main Office, the Reich Commissioner for the Consolidation of German Nationhood, the Volksdeutsche Mittelstelle, and the Lebensborn Society. The defendants faced charges of crimes against humanity, war crimes, and membership in criminal organizations, primarily for their involvement in the Nazi racial program, including the kidnapping of children, deemed racially valuable for Germanization. One of the central figures in the trial was Max Sollmann, the head of the Lebensborn Society. The prosecution accused Lebensborn of participating in the systematic abduction of children from occupied territories to be raised as Germans. However, the court found that of approximately 10,000 foreign-born children located after the war in the American-controlled area of Germany, only 340 had been handled by Lebensborn. The tribunal concluded that prosecution failed to prove with requisite certainty the participation of Lebensborn and its officials in the kidnapping program. The majority of the children associated with Lebensborn were orphans of ethnic Germans. And in isolated instances where children had living parents, Lebensborn sought to avoid taking them. The court acknowledged the existence of a widespread program of kidnapping and forced movement of children in northeastern Europe, but determined that these activities were carried out by individuals or organizations other than Lebensborn. Due to the destruction of archives by SS members prior to fleeing the advancing Allied forces, the exact number of children moved by Lebensborn or other organizations remains unknown. In its judgment on March 10, 1948, the tribunal acquitted Max Sollmann and other Lebensborn officials on charges related to kidnapping. However, Sollmann was found guilty of membership in a criminal organization, the SS, and was sentenced to time already served. Ulrich Grefeld, the chief defendant and head of the RKFDV, was found guilty on all counts and sentenced to life in prison. Other defendants received sentences ranging from 10 to 25 years, with some sentences later reduced or commuted. The Russia trial highlighted the complexities of assigning culpability within the Nazi regime's bureaucratic structures. While the Lebensborn Society was acquitted of direct involvement in the kidnapping of children, the trial underscored the broader context of Nazi racial policies and the roles various organizations played in their implementation. Despite the evidence, most of the defendants received light sentences. The court ruled that Lebensborn itself wasn't a criminal organization. Only certain acts associated with it were. This meant many who had helped the program walked free. While the trials failed to deliver full justice, the real tragedy was felt by the children. In many cases, they had grown up with false identities. When the war ended, some were placed in refugee camps, others in state custody. In the decades after the war, most governments avoided discussing the program. Lebensborn was treated as a shameful, fringe aspect of the Nazi era. Survivors were often dismissed or silenced. Many children only discovered the truth in adulthood, by accident or through the release of declassified files. And even then, answers were hard to find. It wasn't until the 1980s and 90s that serious historical research and survivor testimony began to emerge. Some former Lebensborn children went on personal quests to uncover their origins, traveling across Europe and digging through archives that had been sealed for decades. What they found wasn't always closure. In some cases, entire birth records had been falsified or destroyed. Gunther was one of them. He had always believed that he was a regular German citizen, raised in a patriotic household. But when he applied for a passport in his 50s, discrepancies in his paperwork led to a shocking discovery. He wasn't born in Germany. He was Polish. And the people he had called parents weren't his biological family. Digging further, he uncovered that his real parents had been executed during the Nazi occupation. He had been stolen, tested, and Germanized as a toddler, his identity stripped away before he could speak a word. The Lebensborn controlled women's bodies and children's lives. And all of it started because a group of men believed that only certain people deserved to exist.